This is Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.
And so you get Bunyan basically saying, what Cornelius Van Til talked about, where he talked about there being covenant keepers and covenant breakers. There only being two camps here, right? And so Bunyan, in his own way, is telling us there are only two types of people. There are believers and there are unbelievers. There are those who love the Lord and there are those who hate him.
Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. I'm Jonathan Master, joined as always by my friend and co-host James Dolezal. James, how are you today?
Jonathan, I'm doing well, even as we prepare to descend together into two valleys.
Yes, we're continuing our series on the Pilgrim's Progress with Jeff Stivason, and we are entering somewhat of a dark section of the Pilgrim's Progress, and the Valley of Humiliation and the Valley of the Shadow of Death. So if you're following along in your copy of Pilgrim's Progress, those are the sections that we're going to deal with now. Jeff, thanks for joining us today to discuss these matters.
It's a pleasure to be here with you guys again. And may I set us up with the structure that we talked about last time before we go into the valleys?
Yes, I was hoping you would. I think that's a good way to connect the dots here. Yes, set us up. We came out of Palace Beautiful, but give us a little of the overall structure and how we move from Palace Beautiful to the Valley of Humiliation and the Valley of the Shadow of Death.
Yeah, Christian ends up going to the Palace Beautiful, meets Porter, interviewed by Porter in discretion, and finds himself within the fellowship of believers there, has a great time fellowshipping with them, and then we're going to take a look at his departure from the Palace Beautiful and his descent into the valleys. And the Valley of Humiliation we're going to find that he runs in headlong into Apollyon, and Apollyon is really a dialogue. The battle with Apollyon is really a dialogue with Apollyon, and filled with many snares. And then he goes on into the Valley of the Shadow of Death, and that's a lonely place, and so lonely that demons can suggest things to him that he thinks are his own thoughts. And so it's really kind of a descent from great fellowship into fellowship with snares into no fellowship. And then he hears the voice of faithful afterward, reciting Psalm 23, and fellowship is renewed. And so there's this sense in which Bunyan is really telling us that the church is important. The church is really valuable in your journey from the city of destruction to the celestial city, and so seek fellowship.
So, Jeff, let's talk about the Valley of Humiliation. Having set that context, you mentioned this. The battle with Apollyon is very short, about a paragraph, but the dialogue with Apollyon, it comprises most of the Valley of Humiliation. Is there significance to that? Is there significance to the fact that the battle itself is relatively brief, but the snare infested conversation is longer? Is it just that Bunyan is trying to expand upon what the battle really consists of, or why do you think there is that difference between the attack itself, the battle itself? He comes out armored. He's heard about the victories of Christ in Palace Beautiful, but then the battle isn't itself that significant, it seems.
Yeah. I think when you look at the dialogue between the two, it's encapsulated in Christian's statement. I love the Lord of the Hill. I love his kingdom. I love everything about him. And then Apollyon matches that with, I hate the Lord of the Hill. I hate his people. I hate his land, that sort of thing, right? And so you get Bunyan basically saying, what Cornelius Van Til talked about, where he talked about there being covenant keepers and covenant breakers. There only being two camps here, right? And so Bunyan, in his own way, is telling us there are only two types of people. There are believers and there are unbelievers. There are those who love the Lord and there are those who hate him. And I think that's really kind of the thrust of it. And then I think what he's doing is he's saying, look, you just witnessed a healthy conversation. This is what an unhealthy conversation looks like. And even though we see this between Christian and Apollyon, my guess is that if you think about this conversation, you can see this conversation taking place between a new believer and some of his old friends. For instance, well, you used to, why won't you now? Or when you try to make a virtuous decision, the comeback is, oh, look, you're all righteous now, right? You see, those kind of things are unhealthy conversations. I think what Bunyan is doing is he's leading us into this conversation with Apollyon, but he's really telling us this is what conversations look like outside the church when you meet up with old believers or old friends once you're a believer.
Yeah, and we spoke about at length about the conversation in Palace Beautiful and how instructive it is and how much of a model it really is to us. And this is its opposite. This is what conversation. What you're saying is this is what conversation outside the church is really like.
Yeah, and what happens is when they do engage the battle, he's injured, right? He's injured in his head and in his hands and in his feet, his legs, and the idea is that Bunyan is taking us in a very simple way back to, the dispositional complex of man, his entire being, right? And his thoughts are now scattered, and his behavior is not consistent with what's in the Word, and what happens is, he loses grip on God's Word. The sword flies out of his hand, and he just, at the end of the battle, he's able to grab it again. And Bunyan is telling us, look, when you find yourself in a situation, a conversation with people like this, the only place that you can stand is on the Word of God. And you better take your stand on it, or your foot is going to slip.
There's also a sense in which Apollyon almost claims a kind of proprietorship over Christian when he says, from where do you come? The city of destruction. By this I perceive thou art one of my subjects, for all that country is mine. I'm a prince and a god of it. I think this also gets at the idea of like, you're born a certain way, in a certain place and under a certain condition, and so you shall ever remain.
Yeah.
And I think we even face this now in our own culture, sort of a born this way. This is who I am by birth, as if that is determinative of my future ever after. And it's interesting, the response that Christian makes to that, which is he doesn't deny that he was the God and prince of that place, but he says you were a hard taskmaster. And your wages were horrible. They were death, in fact. And I have found a better prince. And I have to think that when we say that to the world, when we say, you're right, I was like you, and I did serve the things you served, and I loved the things you loved, and I found out that those things actually lead to destruction. And I have found a better prince with a better promise. There's, like, the devil is provoked in this engagement. I think those who serve him also, would you say, Jeff, there's an affront there. They are offended that we wouldn't continue to value what they value and hope in what they hope in. And their ire is provoked as a result, sort of like Apollyon's is here. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. That's well said. I think that's exactly what's happening here, is there's an affront to Apollyon such that you wonder if that's the reason why, or at least in part, that's the reason why I hate the Lord of the Hill. I hate the Lord of the Hill, not just because I hate him, but because you love him and don't love me. Because remember what Apollyon says. He says, okay, you've complained. I heard your complaint. Go back and we'll give you the best that our land has to offer. And the best his land has to offer is not worth even the smallest that the celestial city has to offer.
And the devil is proud. I mean, even the description of him here with his scales and all. I mean, there's a vanity in him, and there's a vanity in his followers as well. How dare you abandon us? And almost treating the Christian, the convert, like a traitor. And in one respects, we are. I mean, isn't this true? We are traitors to a kind of Lord and to a God of this world.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Jeff, how does Apollyon wound Christian? And you've spoken about this a little bit, but how does he wound him, and how does Christian ward him off?
Yeah, I think he's it's I wonder if we're not, if the little paragraph describing the battle is not describing what we saw in the dialogue. Now, that's a little bit of conjecture, but there's a sense in which the fiery darts that Satan throws are those things that seek to undermine our confidence in the Savior. And that's exactly what he was doing in the dialogue. And so there's a sense in which, if you go back to Grace Abounding, where Bunyan talks about how, Satan assailed him, there's a sense in which, when you look at how Satan assailed him in Grace Abounding, it looks a lot like how Apollyon talks to him, suggesting things to him and, kind of curbing his arguments in his own mind and those kind of things. And so one wonders if what we're seeing in the dialogue is not necessarily the battle, therefore the darts that are being thrown at him are actually the conversational darts. I mean, in my mind, that's how I'm looking at it, because when Christian is wounded in his head, right, it's because he's listening to the evil one and not listening to God's word. And so there's some suggestion that might be the way we ought to understand it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That really the battle is the verbal attacks, the doubts that are introduced, the accusations that are made against Christians. So how is he healed then from the wound that's inflicted by the enemy, those fiery darts?
Yeah, this is beautiful, isn't it? And it's in between the valleys. But here's the beautiful thing. I think that the descent into the valley, where the church leads him down, along with the pastor, leads him down into the valley, and this little reprieve kind of go hand in hand. And the reason for that is the church gives Christian gifts before he goes into the valley, and they're the same gifts that you find in 2 Samuel 16. They're the gifts that Mephibosheth gives to David before he heads off into the wilderness. And so here you find Christian taking those gifts out, some of those gifts out, and basically drawing down on them for strength. But the thing that really helps is not the Christian fellowship, although it's alluded to in him drinking from the bottle that he had been given a short time ago. The thing that really helps is the hand that appears out of nowhere, offering him the branch of the tree of life, the fruit of the tree of life. And as he takes it, what we're to understand is that he's forgiven for anything that he's said or done when the sword was out of his hand, right? When he was thinking or doing in an unbecoming way in the valley, in the conflict with Apollyon, he is now forgiven fully and freely. And I think that when Bunyan places that image alongside the image of the church's gifts, I think you have to draw down on what Bunyan is saying. I think what he's saying is the gifts from the church aren't ultimate. Christian fellowship is not ultimate, but it's not nothing either. And so there's a beautiful sense in which those things cohere. And if I can, does that make sense? I want to add something to that, but I want to pause.
It does. And I want to hear what you're going to add, but it also underscores something that's always kind of surprising leading into the Valley of Humiliation, which you mentioned, which is they lead him down into it. So he leaves the palace beautiful, and they're leading him down. They're equipping him for it, but they're not with him in it. So there's a sense in which he has to on his own face these things, but he doesn't face them without resources that are even resources from the church.
Yeah, when I think about this conversation with Apollyon, I think about a conversation I had with a secular philosophy professor when I first started my academic journey. I started taking a class at a secular university to see how I had been out of school for 4 years, and I didn't know how the gears in the brain would work. And so anyway, I took this class, and 28 days after I started the class, my brother was murdered. And I took a week off of classes, and I came back, and I had, in 28 days, I had made my Christianity apparently known enough that I sat down with this professor in his office, and he leaned back in his chair and he said to me, "So tell me, what do you think of your God now?" And I think to myself, that's Apollyon, right? Trying to undermine one's faith at the hard moments, but yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. All right. He moved. We should sort of sit on that a little bit. That's a powerful illustration. But let's move. Let's move to the Valley of the Shadow of Death. Is the Valley of the Shadow of Death? I want to talk about what it represents, but it almost seems as if it's worse than the direct combat with Apollyon. So Apollyon makes these accusations, and they're serious. Christian has answers for them. It doesn't mean it's not challenging, but he has ready answers. But the Valley of the Shadow of Death, and maybe this is a little bit of a subjective impression, but it almost seems like a worse trial, a worse challenge than the Valley of Humiliation.
I think he does. If I don't, I'd have to put my eye on it, but I do think he actually says that. I think he actually compares the valley and sees the one. It's on page 72. He says, "For you must note that though the first part of the valley of the shadow of death was dangerous, yet this second part, which he was yet to go, was, if possible, far more dangerous." So yeah, absolutely. And I think it's more dangerous because I think that he's alone. I mean, when you're in the midst of combat with somebody about the faith, there's a certain sense in which you're drawing down on all the resources, even if you slip and, get caught up. I think it's interesting because when he's on his way down the valley with the church, it says that he did slip a time or two. And then, and then you see him in the valley, and there's a slippage that takes place, and he has to repent and receive forgiveness. But it's when he gets into this valley where he's utterly alone that I think that's more dangerous, because you're not, the attack is not coming head on so that you can draw down on it, right? The attack is coming from behind you, and it's whispering in your ear, and you begin to think that it's your own thought. And, if I can just add at this point, today is the 4-month anniversary, as you know, of my wife's passing. And I think that I understand this valley because, when you walk through this valley, there are all sorts of people. You have a wonderful church and you have wonderful friends, and they all want to, and you among them, they want to be with you, and if possible, even take the burden from you. But you begin to realize that there's a certain aloneness that you feel, that even when you're in the room with people, it just can't alleviate. And I think when I look at the gifts that they've given him, this is Christians at the rim of the valley calling down to him, encouraging him, but he's alone in the valley, and he has to be alone in the valley. And one of the things that I don't think I understood in the midst of loss was how people can either want to go back or they want to stay right where they are. You know, like the person who doesn't ever change the room of the child that passes, or the person who constantly longs to go backward and remember the days of old. And I can see where those are real temptations. I think the Lord is preserving me from them, but I can see where those are real temptations to want to stay or to want to go back. And anyway, I just think that this section in Pilgrim's Progress has kind of come alive to me in these days.
Do you think, and this is a question both about the book and even about what you just expressed, do you think that part of the deep challenge of the Valley of the Shadow of Death in this book, and then again in your own experience, is that Christians don't often recognize that it is that there are snares associated with it, or that there are temptations associated with it? In other words, you mentioned the fact that in the valley, when he's with Apollyon, he knows he's in war mode. He knows he's at battle, and he doesn't get everything right, but he's in that mode. And I wonder if one of the differences is that when he's by himself, it's easy to lose sight of the fact when you're isolated that is a kind of that has challenges too. That in a sense, you kind of have to be in war mode. Is that maybe what I'm saying doesn't resonate?
No, it does. It does very much so. And here's the interesting thing. I think that aloneness in the midst of the valley is probably not the way that Bunyan is, the way I've described it is probably not the way Bunyan has described it. For instance, there's the ditch and the quag, and the ditch is where the blind lead the blind, right? There's the false teacher, and then the quag is the miry ditch the miry quag in which David almost fell. That's immorality, right? So again, you have teaching and behavior on either side, and so when I think of this, I think maybe what Bunyan was thinking about was, here David is supposed to be out in battling Apollyon, and instead, when it's time for the kings to go out and battle, he's alone at home, and he fell into the quag, right? And so aloneness can be, I think, a loss, and that's kind of where I am, right? But aloneness can be where you sort of quarantine a section of your life and don't allow other Christians in. And when you're alone, or in that sense, and I'm talking internally living a double life, that's when you're alone and vulnerable. So I
Jeff,
think,
do you think this is also where he becomes he almost becomes an enigma to himself, because he doesn't know whether the voice is his own, or whether it's that of a tempter, because he's sort of removed himself from Christian community, close fellowship with God, obedience.
I mean, think about it. This is mistrust, right? And he's going to run into diffidence later. And so there's a sense in which Bunyan is helping us to kind of understand that that mistrust, lack of faith, all of these things are not uncommon to the Christian. That they are things that the Christian will battle, and
He hears a voice. He's walking. He's alone, but then, and he's not sure which voice, his voice or that of a devil. But then he does hear another voice that's neither his nor that of one of the fiends, citing Psalm 23, verse 4. And then we're told, then he was glad. So he's still in the shadow. He's still in the valley of the shadow of death. But before he exits it, he does actually find a gladness as he makes his way toward the end. Could you speak a little bit to that as well.
Yeah, Bunyan is returning us to the idea of Christian fellowship because Christian realizes that if there's somebody else in the valley who's afraid and God is with them, then why couldn't God be with him, Christian, as well? And so there's a sense in which Christian fellowship reignites, hope and zeal and it ignites faith, faith that was maybe timorous and small. And so I think what, again, as we round out this section, Palace Beautiful, Valley of Humiliation, Valley of the Shadow of Death, I think Bunyan has been telling us how important Christian fellowship is to the journey.
Jeff, as always, appreciate your insights into this work, and thanks as well for your candor today. This is just when I think that I know this book well and I've thought about it, I realize I barely scratched the surface of it. So thanks for coming on and helping us navigate through it.
Oh, thank you. It's always a pleasure to be with you guys.
And we look forward to picking this up again in the future, talking about the relationship with a newfound Christian friend, Faithful, and then their journey into Vanity Fair. So those who've been tracking with us as you read ahead, read the engagement of Christian and Faithful, and then also the scene of Vanity Fair, and we hope in near future to discuss that together on our podcast.
James, it's hard to know exactly what to say because Jeff not only explained the text better than either of us could, but applied it with great clarity and it strikes me that what he did in this conversation is exactly what Faithful does for Christian as he's in the valley of the shadow of death. And he hears someone else who's in there too, and who is rehearsing the reality of God's presence with him.
Maybe somebody listening to this episode is like Christian, walking through the valley, feeling alone and desperate right now. And, our brother, our friend Jeff has walked a difficult path, even in recent months, with the passing of his wife, and even as he reflected there in years past on the murder of his brother, that in fact, though he walks through the valley of the shadow of death, he'll fear no evil because God is with him. His rod and staff comfort him. And perhaps one of our listeners is hearing Jeff rehearse the faithfulness of God in his own life now, and should, like Christian, take encouragement from that and draw near to God's people. I think it's tempting when we are in real adversity to just pull away by ourselves, and then we lose even the ability to hear our own voice or know our own voice. It's important, in fact, that we are drawing near to God's people and being encouraged by them.
We always commend the Pilgrim's Progress to our listeners. We have copies that you can enter for a chance to win at placefortruth.org or theologyonthego.org. There's a spot there to enter your information. And if you know someone who'd be helped by this episode, I think this episode in particular might be a good one to share with others. And so if you know someone that might be helped, please pass it along. If you can rate and review the podcast, that helps us just get the word out more broadly. And if you're able to donate to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can do that at alliancenet.org or placefortruth.org. And as always, we thank you for listening to Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.